The war was over. The Dravik fleet was retreating. Across the Varex Empire, billions celebrated what many were calling a miracle. Cities filled with cheers. Warships sounded victory signals. For the first time in weeks, people felt hope instead of fear. And everywhere, one name was being repeated. Ethan Ward, the human who had saved an empire. But inside the royal palace, one final matter remained unfinished. The traitor. The noble who had secretly worked with the Dravik. The man whose greed had nearly destroyed everything. Within days of the victory, royal forces located him. He had attempted to flee beyond Imperial space. He never made it. Now he stood in chains before the Imperial Council. The largest courtroom in the Empire was completely full. Military leaders, nobles, governors, journalists. Every important figure had come to witness the trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Secret communications, financial transfers, military records. Every crime was exposed. The noble knew it too. His confidence had vanished. At last, Queen Lyra rose from her throne. The entire chamber became silent. You betrayed your people. Her voice echoed throughout the hall. You aided an enemy invasion. The noble lowered his head. You caused the deaths of countless citizens. No one defended him. No one spoke on his behalf. Even former allies wanted nothing to do with him. The verdict was immediate.
Guilty.
The courtroom erupted in applause. For many citizens, justice had finally arrived. But while the Empire celebrated the end of the conspiracy, another event was quickly approaching. A far more important event. The Queen's announcement. For weeks, rumors had spread across the galaxy. Would she still honor her decision? Would she still choose the human? Or had everything changed? Nobody knew. The answer finally came 7 days later. Representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered at the Imperial Plaza. The enormous square had never held so many people. Thousands stood in person. Billions watched through broadcasts. The atmosphere felt electric. Excitement filled the air. At the center of the plaza stood a grand ceremonial platform. Golden banners moved in the wind. Imperial guards lined the pathways. Then the crowd suddenly erupted. Queen Lyra had arrived. Dressed in royal white and silver, she walked toward the platform. Moments later, Ethan appeared beside her. The reaction shocked him. People cheered.
Loudly.
The same empire that had once laughed at humans now welcomed him as a hero. Children waved banners with his name. Veterans saluted him. Citizens chanted for him. It was almost impossible to believe. Only weeks earlier, many of these same people had doubted him. Now they celebrated him. The ceremony began. An elder stepped forward carrying an ancient royal document, one that had existed for thousands of years. The first law of Varex. His voice echoed across the plaza. The crowd immediately became quiet. Everyone knew what was coming. The elder continued. By tradition, the ruler may choose the strongest warrior as a royal mate. A wave of anticipation spread through the audience. Then Queen Lyra stepped forward. She looked across the crowd, across the empire, across the galaxy watching from afar. Finally, her eyes settled on Ethan. Months ago, she had chosen him because of his strength. Now there were far more reasons. She had seen his courage, his loyalty, his honor, his willingness to risk everything for people who weren't even his own species. Those qualities mattered far more than strength. The Queen smiled, a rare sight that immediately captured everyone's attention. Then she spoke. Ethan Ward. The entire plaza fell silent. My choice remains unchanged. Cheers began instantly. But Lyra wasn't finished. She continued. You protected this empire when others abandoned it. The crowd erupted again. You stood against impossible odds. More cheers. You reminded us that greatness is not defined by species. Now, even military leaders were applauding. Then came the moment everyone would remember. Queen Lyra extended her hand toward Ethan. I choose you. The plaza exploded. The sound was deafening. People shouted, celebrated,
cheered.
Across countless worlds, citizens witnessed the historic moment. A human and a queen. A pairing nobody could have imagined months earlier. For a brief second, Ethan looked around at the crowd, at the Empire, at the people whose lives had changed forever. Then he smiled and took her hand. The roar that followed was even louder than before. Fireworks filled the sky above the capital. Warships released streams of light across orbit. The celebration spread throughout the Empire. But for many people, the most important part wasn't the ceremony. It was what the moment represented. For generations, species had divided themselves. They focused on differences, on fears, on old beliefs. Now those barriers were beginning to disappear. Not because of politics, not because of laws, but because one human had proven what was possible. As the celebration continued, Ethan and Lyra stood together overlooking the endless crowd below. The future remained uncertain. New challenges would come. New enemies would rise. That was the nature of the galaxy. But they would face it together. And far beyond the capital, a new saying began spreading from world to world. Never underestimate a human. Because sometimes the person everyone expects to fail becomes the one who changes history. And sometimes, the strongest warrior wins far more than a battle. He wins the heart of a queen. The strike ship disappeared into deep space. Behind it stood the fleets of the Verex Empire. Ahead of it waited more than 3,000 enemy warships. For most people, the mission sounded impossible.
For Ethan, it was simply the next step.
Inside the command chamber, the strike team studied the latest intelligence reports. A holographic image of the Dravik flagship floated above the table. It was enormous, nearly 10 times larger than a normal battleship. Its weapons alone could destroy entire cities. And somewhere inside that giant fortress was the command center controlling the invasion. Destroy that command center, and the entire enemy fleet could fall into chaos. That was the plan, at least in theory. The problem was getting there alive. Hours later, the strike ship approached the outer edge of the Dravik formation. The sight was terrifying. Thousands of warships stretched across space. The fleet looked endless. Even veteran soldiers became quiet. One wrong move, and they would all die. The pilot glanced toward Ethan. Still think this is possible? Ethan looked through the viewport. Ask me after we're done. The ship continued forward. Using stolen identification codes, they slipped through several security checkpoints. So far, everything was working. Then, alarms suddenly appeared across the cockpit. Detection scan. The crew froze. One officer cursed under his breath. If the enemy identified them now, the mission would end immediately. The scans swept across the vessel. Seconds felt like hours. Then the warning disappeared. The crew released a collective breath. They had passed. But everyone knew their luck wouldn't last forever. Finally, the flagship came into view. The massive vessel looked like a floating planet. Weapons covered its surface. Fighter squadrons moved around it constantly. It was the strongest ship Ethan had ever seen. And he intended to board it. Using a maintenance access route discovered by Verex intelligence, the strike team entered the flagship unnoticed. The moment they stepped inside, the mission became a race against time. Every corridor contained armed soldiers. Every security system threatened to expose them. Yet they kept moving deeper, level after level, section after section, until they finally reached the command core. But what they discovered there changed everything. A holographic meeting was taking place. Several Dravik commanders stood around a central table, and among them appeared a familiar face. Ethan froze. Queen Lyra froze. Even the strike team stared in disbelief. The figure wasn't Dravik. He was Verexian, one of the Empire's highest-ranking nobles. The same noble who had publicly opposed Ethan from the beginning. The same noble house connected to the assassination attempts. Suddenly, everything made sense. The conspiracy,
The attacks.
the invasion. It had all been connected. The noble wasn't trying to protect the Empire. He was trying to seize control of it. By helping the Dravik weaken Verex, he planned to gain power during the chaos. Millions of lives meant nothing to him. The revelation shocked everyone. But there was no time to process it. One of the enemy officers spotted the strike team. Intruders. The flagship erupted into chaos. Sirens echoed through every corridor. Security forces rushed toward their position. The mission had entered its final stage. Ethan immediately gave the order. Plant the charges. The team moved. Explosive devices were attached throughout the command center. Enemy troops flooded into the area. A fierce battle erupted. Energy blasts struck walls. Explosions shook the deck. The strike team fought desperately to hold their position. Then disaster struck. One of the charges was destroyed before activation. Without it, the command core would survive. And if the command core survived, the fleet would remain operational. The entire mission would fail. Ethan made a decision. A dangerous one. He grabbed the final explosive device. "What are you doing?" one soldier shouted. Ethan didn't answer. He sprinted directly toward the center of the command system. Enemy fire followed him from every direction. The strike team watched in horror. One hit. Just one hit would kill him. But somehow he kept moving. Closer. Closer. Finally, he reached the target. He activated the explosive. Then ran. The world disappeared in white light. A massive explosion tore through the flagship. Shockwaves raced through every section of the vessel. The command center vanished. Control systems failed. Communication networks collapsed. Across space, thousands of Dravik warships suddenly lost contact with their leaders. Confusion spread instantly. Fleet formations broke apart. Orders stopped arriving. The invasion force began falling into chaos. And that was the moment Queen Lyra attacked. Waiting beyond the enemy formation, the Varex fleet launched its assault. Hundreds of warships jumped into battle. The stars themselves seemed to ignite. For the first time, the Dravik were disorganized. For the first time, they were vulnerable. For the first time, they could lose. The battle raged for hours. Ship against ship. Fleet against fleet. Entire sections of space became war zones. Yet little by little, the advantage shifted. Without leadership, the Dravik commanders struggled to coordinate. Varex forces pressed harder. Victory slowly moved within reach. Then the impossible happened. The remaining Dravik ships began retreating. At first only a few, then hundreds, then thousands. The invasion was over. The Empire had survived. Cheers erupted across every Varex vessel. Soldiers celebrated. Commanders embraced. Citizens watching from distant worlds cried with relief. Against all odds, they had won. And at the center of that victory stood one human. A human who had exposed the conspiracy. A human who had destroyed the enemy command structure. A human who had saved an entire empire. But while the galaxy celebrated, Ethan stood silently aboard the damaged strike ship. Because he knew one thing. The war was over. Yet one final battle still remained. The traitor responsible for everything was still alive. And soon, he would have to answer for what he had done. The palace never truly slept anymore. Since the assassination attempts, guards stood at every entrance. Warships patrolled the skies above the capital. Every day brought new reports, new suspects, new secrets. Yet despite countless investigations, Queen Lyra and Ethan still couldn't identify the true mastermind behind the conspiracy. Whoever was controlling the noble houses remained hidden. And that was the most dangerous part, because hidden enemies were often the hardest to defeat. 3 days later, Ethan sat inside the royal war room studying intelligence reports. Huge holographic screens filled the chamber. Military movements, trade routes, political records. Thousands of pieces of information flowed across the displays. Most people would have been overwhelmed, but Ethan noticed something strange. A pattern. Several military outposts along the Empire's outer border had suddenly gone silent. No communications. No distress calls. Nothing. At first glance it seemed unimportant, but the more Ethan looked, the worse it became. The missing outposts formed a line. A direct path toward Varex territory. His instincts immediately sounded an alarm. Lyra. The Queen looked up from another report. What is it? Ethan pointed at the map. These stations didn't fail randomly. Several advisors moved closer. One military officer frowned. They could be communication malfunctions. Ethan shook his head. No. His finger traced the pattern. This is preparation. The room became silent. Preparation for what? Before anyone could answer, alarms suddenly echoed throughout the war room. A communications officer rushed inside. His face had turned pale. Your Majesty, everyone stood. The officer struggled to catch his breath. We just received emergency transmissions from the outer sectors. What happened? Lyra asked. The officer swallowed. They're gone. The room froze. What do you mean gone? The colonies. His voice shook. Entire colonies have disappeared. Shock spread across the chamber. Several advisors stared in disbelief. Whole colonies didn't simply disappear. Not without warning. Not without evidence. Not without survivors. A holographic image appeared above the central table. Destroyed cities. Burning landscapes. Orbital stations reduced to wreckage. The images grew worse with every report. Someone had attacked. And they had attacked with overwhelming force. The officer activated another transmission. A damaged recording from one of the final survivors appeared. The alien on screen was injured. Terrified. His voice cracked as he spoke. They came from nowhere. Explosions echoed behind him. Our defenses couldn't stop them. The image flickered. Massive warships appeared in the distance. Ships unlike anything the Empire had seen before.
Dark.
Enormous. Terrifying. The transmission ended. Silence filled the room. One admiral finally spoke. The Dravik. Several military officers immediately looked worried. The name alone carried fear. The Dravik were one of the most ruthless species in known space. For decades they had conquered world after world. Every civilization that resisted was destroyed. Every civilization that surrendered became their servant. Entire star systems had vanished beneath their rule. And now they were coming here. A military strategist stepped forward. How large is their fleet? The answer arrived seconds later. The room fell silent again. More than 3,000 warships. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Even the Empire's strongest fleets would struggle against numbers like that. One nervous advisor spoke first. We should negotiate. Another nodded. Perhaps surrender is the wiser option. Others quickly agreed. Fear spread through the room. For the first time since the crisis began, some leaders had already accepted defeat. Ethan listened quietly. Then he stood. The room gradually became silent. Everyone wanted to hear what the human would say. Ethan looked directly at the holographic fleet. Thousands of enemy ships. An invasion force capable of crushing entire civilizations. Most people saw hopeless odds. Ethan saw something else. An opportunity. They're not invincible. Several officers exchanged doubtful looks. One admiral crossed his arms. You've seen the numbers. I have. And you still think we can win? Ethan nodded. The room stared. Because armies don't win wars. Confused expressions appeared everywhere. Ethan pointed toward the enemy formation. Leaders do. Now people were listening carefully. If we destroy their command structure, the fleet loses coordination. The military officers began studying the data again. For the first time, the impossible sounded possible. Ethan continued. We don't fight all 3,000 ships. He pointed toward a highlighted vessel, the largest ship in the enemy fleet. We hit this. The flagship. Several advisors immediately objected. That's suicide. It's impossible. No strike team could reach it. Ethan remained calm. Then we'll be the first. Silence returned. The plan was insane, dangerous, possibly fatal. Yet nobody could offer a better alternative. Queen Lyra studied him carefully. Most leaders saw problems. Ethan searched for solutions. It was one of the reasons she trusted him. Finally, she stood. The operation will proceed. Several advisors looked shocked. Your Majesty, my decision is final. Nobody argued further. The Queen had spoken. Preparations began immediately. Special forces assembled. Ships were selected. Mission plans were created. Across the Empire, news of the approaching invasion spread rapidly. Fear gripped billions of citizens. Many believed the end was near. But inside the palace hangar, Ethan prepared for the most dangerous mission of his life. As engineers fueled the strike vessel, Lyra approached him. For a moment neither spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. You know the chances. Ethan smiled slightly. Not great. A rare smile appeared on her face. That's one way to describe them. The moment quickly passed. Duty returned. The mission was ready. The strike team boarded their ship. Engines roared to life. The hangar doors slowly opened. Beyond them waited an enemy fleet capable of destroying an empire. And somewhere within that fleet was the hidden force threatening everything. The assassinations. The conspiracy. The invasion. For the first time, Ethan suspected they were all connected. But to prove it, he would have to enter the heart of enemy territory. And if he failed, there might not be an empire left to save. The celebration was over. The cheering crowds were gone. Now the palace felt different. Quiet.
Tense.
Dangerous. Only hours after Queen Lyra had publicly chosen Ethan as her mate, someone had already tried to kill him. That fact changed everything. Royal guards doubled their patrols. Security checkpoints appeared throughout the palace. Nobody knew who could be trusted anymore. And that worried Lyra more than the assassination attempt itself. Because attacks like this did not happen without help from powerful people.
Someone on the inside was involved.
The next morning, Ethan stood on a palace balcony overlooking the capital city. Thousands of flying vehicles moved between enormous towers. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. But beneath that beauty, something dark was growing. Footsteps approached. Queen Lyra joined him. The investigation has started, she said. Any suspects? Ethan asked. Lyra shook her head. Too many. That wasn't a good answer. If the list of suspects was that large, the conspiracy might be much bigger than they thought. Before Ethan could respond, alarms suddenly echoed through the palace. Red warning lights flashed across the walls. Both Ethan and Lyra turned instantly. A guard's voice blasted through the emergency system. Security breach detected. Security breach detected. All personnel report immediately. The Queen's expression hardened. Stay behind me. Ethan almost laughed. After everything she had seen him do, she still thought he needed protection. Within seconds, armed guards flooded the hallways. Reports arrived one after another. Unknown intruders had entered the palace. No identification. No demands. No communication. Just a direct path toward Ethan's location. They're assassins, Lyra said. The realization hit immediately. The sniper had failed. Now someone was trying again. Only this time they weren't hiding. They were sending professionals. The palace security feeds suddenly appeared on nearby screens. Masked figures moved through corridors with terrifying efficiency. Every guard who confronted them was defeated within seconds. These were not ordinary killers. They were elite operatives. The best money could buy. One advisor turned pale. Who would spend this much to eliminate one human? Nobody answered, because everyone already knew. The people behind this attack were powerful. Very powerful. Minutes later, the assassins reached Ethan's wing. The first guard unit opened fire. Energy blasts filled the corridor. The attackers kept advancing. One by one, guards fell back. The situation was getting worse.
Fast.
Then Ethan stepped forward. Lyra grabbed his arm.
Ethan, wait.
He looked at her calmly. If they came for me, then let me deal with them. Before anyone could stop him, he walked directly toward the approaching assassins. The guards stared in disbelief. The attackers did too. Perhaps they expected fear. Perhaps they expected him to run. Instead, the human moved toward them. The lead assassin raised a weapon. Big mistake. Ethan exploded into motion. The first attacker hit the floor before anyone realized what happened. The second tried to react. Too slow. The third swung an energy blade. Ethan dodged and disarmed him instantly. The corridor became chaos. Within moments, the elite assassins found themselves fighting for survival. Every move they made failed. Every attack was countered. The palace guards watched in shock. They had trained for years. Yet Ethan moved like someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this. Finally, the last assassin crashed into a wall. Defeated. The corridor fell silent. Only heavy breathing remained. The attackers who had terrified the palace security forces were lying unconscious on the floor. Defeated by a single human, Lyra stared at Ethan. For a brief moment, she understood exactly why he had won the grand trial. This wasn't just strength. This was experience, discipline, control, the result of years of hardship. But the biggest surprise came minutes later. One assassin regained consciousness during interrogation. At first, he refused to speak. Then he noticed Ethan standing nearby. Something changed. Fear appeared in his eyes. Real fear. Finally, he spoke. "We were hired." The room became silent. "Hired by who?" Lyra demanded. The assassin hesitated. Then he gave an answer nobody expected. "A coalition." Several advisors exchanged confused looks. "What coalition?" Ethan asked. The assassin swallowed hard. "Powerful noble houses." The room exploded with shock. "Nobles? The attack came from inside the Empire?" The assassin nodded. "They believe the human threatens their future." Every word made the situation worse. The conspiracy wasn't the work of a single enemy. It involved multiple noble families, people with wealth, influence, political power, people close to the throne. Suddenly, the assassination attempts made sense. If Ethan became the queen's mate, everything would change. Old power structures would collapse. New alliances would form. Many nobles would lose influence, and some were willing to kill to prevent it. The assassin revealed one final piece of information before being taken away. "There is someone above them." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The assassin looked directly at her. "The nobles are taking orders from someone else." A chill spread through the room. Someone else? Someone even more powerful? That meant the conspiracy reached higher than anyone imagined. Much higher. As night fell over the capital city, Ethan and Lyra stood together in the royal war room. The evidence covered every screen. The assassination attempt, the noble houses, the hidden network. It was all connected. But one question remained unanswered. Who was really pulling the strings? And why were they so desperate to stop a human from standing beside the queen? Neither of them knew the answer. Yet both understood one thing. The attacks were not over. In fact, they were probably just beginning. And somewhere in the darkness, an enemy far more dangerous than the assassins was already making their next move. The celebration inside the arena continued long after the final match ended. Crowds chanted Ethan's name. Commentators replayed his victories again and again. Across the galaxy, billions watched the human who had done the impossible. But Ethan wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about leaving. The tournament was over. He had won. Now all that remained was collecting his prize and returning to Earth. At least, that was what he thought. As he walked through a corridor beneath the arena, a squad of royal guards suddenly appeared. Their armor gleamed under the lights. Their expressions were unreadable. The captain stepped forward. "Ethan Ward." Ethan nodded. "The Queen requests your presence." A request from Queen Lyra wasn't really a request. Minutes later, Ethan found himself inside the royal palace. The place was enormous. Golden walls stretched toward a ceiling covered in ancient symbols. Massive windows overlooked the shining capital city. Everything around him screamed power. At the far end of the chamber sat Queen Lyra. For the first time, Ethan saw her up close. She wasn't wearing battle armor today. Instead, she wore royal robes marked with the symbols of her empire. Yet somehow she looked even more intimidating. Around her stood nobles, generals, advisors, and members of the royal family. Every important person in the empire seemed to be present. And every eye in the room was fixed on Ethan. The atmosphere felt strange, almost tense, as if everyone was waiting for something. A royal advisor stepped forward. Human Ethan Ward. His voice echoed through the chamber. "You have achieved a historic victory in the grand trial." Polite applause followed. Ethan nodded respectfully. "Thank you." The advisor continued. "Her Majesty will now announce your reward." That made sense. A reward. Maybe credits. Maybe land. Maybe some kind of medal. The queen slowly rose from her throne. The entire room became silent. Even the advisors looked nervous. Lyra walked down the steps until she stood directly in front of Ethan. For several seconds, she simply looked at him. Then she spoke. "In all my years, I have never witnessed a warrior like you." The nobles exchanged glances. The queen rarely praised anyone. "You defeated every challenger." She took another step forward. "You showed courage, discipline, and strength." Ethan wasn't sure where this was going. Neither was anyone else. Then Queen Lyra turned toward the court. According to the first law of Verex, a sudden wave of whispers spread through the room. Some nobles looked alarmed. Others looked terrified. The queen continued. "The strongest warrior may be chosen by the ruler as a royal mate." The room froze. Ethan blinked. Surely he had heard that wrong. Then Lyra pointed directly at him. "I choose Ethan Ward." Silence. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. Then chaos exploded. Impossible. A human. This cannot happen. Several nobles jumped to their feet. Military officers began shouting objections. Even some royal advisors looked horrified. The noise became deafening. Ethan stood there completely stunned. A few hours ago he had entered a tournament. Now the most powerful woman in the sector was claiming him as her mate. This had to be a misunderstanding. But one look at Lyra's face told him otherwise. She was completely serious. A gray-haired noble stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this tradition was never intended for outsiders." Another noble pointed directly at Ethan. "He's human." The room erupted again. The queen's expression hardened. Instantly the chamber fell silent. "You question our laws." Nobody answered. "You question my authority." Still silence. The nobles lowered their eyes. Lyra's voice became cold. "The law is clear." She turned toward Ethan. "And my decision has been made." For the first time, Ethan finally spoke. "Your Majesty." Every eye in the room turned toward him. "I think we should talk about this first." A few nervous laughs appeared. Even Lyra almost smiled. But before anyone could continue, a palace officer rushed into the chamber. He looked terrified. "Your Majesty." The officer dropped to one knee. "There has been a security breach." The room immediately became alert. "What happened?" Lyra demanded. The officer swallowed hard. A sniper was discovered near the palace perimeter. The chamber became silent again. A sniper? Inside the royal district? That wasn't normal. Then the officer added something even worse. The weapon was aimed toward the route Ethan Ward was scheduled to take when leaving the city. Shock spread across the court. Someone had already tried to kill him. The realization hit everyone at once. This wasn't about tradition anymore. This wasn't about politics. Someone wanted Ethan dead. And they had acted less than an hour after the Queen's announcement. Lyra's eyes narrowed dangerously. The nobles suddenly looked nervous. Very nervous. Because if someone was willing to assassinate the human, it meant powerful enemies were already moving in the shadows. And deep down, Ethan had a feeling this was only the beginning. The tournament was over. But the real battle had just begun. The arena of Verex Prime was louder than a thunderstorm. More than 100,000 spectators filled the massive stadium. Warriors from every corner of the galaxy had gathered for the grand trial, a tournament where only the strongest survived. The crowd cheered as giant fighters entered the arena. Some had 4 arms. Some wore powered armor. Others had claws sharp enough to cut steel. Then the announcer spoke a name that made the entire stadium laugh. Ethan Ward, representative of Earth. A single human walked through the gate. No armor. No bodyguards. No special weapons. Just a calm expression. The laughter became even louder. Humans were still new to the galactic community. Most species considered them average at best. A few spectators even started placing bets on how quickly Ethan would lose. High above the arena, inside the royal viewing chamber, Queen Lyra watched with mild curiosity. She had heard stories about humans. Most were unimpressive. Yet something about this one seemed different. While every other fighter looked nervous, Ethan appeared completely relaxed. As if he didn't care who stood against him. As if he already knew something nobody else did. The first challenger entered the arena. The crowd immediately erupted. It was Gorak of Kor, a massive warrior over 10 feet tall. His species was famous for crushing opponents with pure strength. He looked at Ethan and laughed. "You are the human?" Ethan nodded. Gorak smiled. "I almost feel sorry for you." The crowd loved it. Many expected the fight to end within seconds. The signal sounded. Gorak charged. The ground shook beneath his feet. Spectators leaned forward. This was going to be brutal. Then Ethan moved. In one blink, he wasn't standing where he had been. Gorak swung at empty air. The giant looked confused. A second later, Ethan appeared beside him. One precise strike. The giant froze. Another strike. Then another. Suddenly, Gorak collapsed face first into the arena floor. The entire stadium fell silent. Nobody understood what they had just seen. The undefeated giant was unconscious. And the human wasn't even breathing hard. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the medical team rushed forward. The scanners confirmed it. Gorak had lost. Completely. The laughter disappeared. Now the crowd stared. Queen Lyra leaned forward. For the first time that day, she looked genuinely interested. "Interesting," she whispered. The announcer cleared his throat. "The winner, Ethan Ward of Earth." Scattered murmurs spread across the stadium. Some believed it was luck. Others thought Gorak had underestimated him. Either way, the next challenger stepped forward. This one was faster, smarter, a veteran champion. The fight lasted less than a minute. He lost too. Then came another warrior, and another, and another. Each one entered confidently. Each one left defeated. As the victories continued, the atmosphere changed. People stopped laughing. They stopped talking. They simply watched. No matter what challenge appeared, Ethan adapted. A stronger opponent. A faster opponent. A more experienced opponent. It didn't matter. The human kept winning. Hours later, only one fighter remained. The reigning champion of Varix Prime. A warrior feared across multiple star systems. Even Ethan looked slightly impressed when he entered. The champion raised his weapon. "I have defeated everyone." His eyes narrowed. "But I have never faced a human." The arena became silent once more. Even Queen Lyra stood from her throne. This was the fight everyone would remember. The signal sounded. The champion attacked immediately. Unlike the others, he was careful, disciplined, dangerous. For the first time all day, Ethan was forced backward. The crowd erupted. Finally, someone could challenge him. The battle continued for several intense minutes. Blow after blow. Attack after attack. Neither fighter gave an inch. Then something changed. The champion made a mistake. A tiny mistake. Most spectators never noticed it. Ethan did. In a single movement, he seized the opening. The champion's weapon flew from his hands. A second later, he was staring at the arena floor. Defeated. The stadium exploded. People stood screaming. Others simply stared in disbelief. The impossible had happened. A human had defeated every warrior in the tournament. But while the crowd celebrated, Queen Lyra wasn't watching the defeated champion. She was watching Ethan, studying him, the way he moved, the way he fought, the way he never showed fear. For the first time in many years, her heart was racing. And that worried her. Because among her people, there was an ancient tradition. A tradition older than the empire itself. The strongest warrior could be chosen by the queen. Not as a soldier. Not as a champion. But as her mate. As Ethan stood in the center of the arena, completely unaware of what was coming next, Queen Lyra made a decision. A decision that would shock the entire galaxy. And change both of their lives forever.